Okay, then I'd like to, during this time, it's a little bit out of order for us, but I'd like to introduce our visiting preacher for the day, because she's going to play a major role in the service, and so I want to do the introduction before she appears before you, rather than interrupt later on. Pam Phillips says that after a career as a middle school teacher and a committed lay leader at her home congregation in Charlottesville, she took an early retirement to answer the call of ministry by attending Meadville Lombard Theological School. Called to serve the Unitarian Universalist congregation in Blacksburg in 2017, she and her husband, Reverend Jamie McReynolds, who's also here, have enjoyed settling into their new community and discovering all it has to offer. So we welcome Pam and Jamie to our service today and look forward to their participation. We're going to have a special treat this morning. Pam is going to do a conversation with the children. So if the children would be willing to come up, and if they're really small, a parent can come up with them.
Good morning. Good morning. I just want to say I bring greetings from Blacksburg, Virginia. A lot of happy Hokie fans. I think they won their football game. Yes? Yes. So I brought my friend. I understand you all are talking about your favorite books. Does anyone know who this is? What? Sally. You know, actually, they don't know. Does anyone know who this is? Yes. Raise your hand if you had one of these when you were little. Look at all those people. How old do you think this is? It is a doll. I got this Raggedy Ann doll when I was probably about 7 or 8 years old. Look how old I am now. And I still have her. And I love her. Do you have anything that belongs to you that you love? What do you have, Percy?
I have a special blanket that I like.
Oh, a special blanket, yes. Do you have something you love?
A blanket.
You have a blanket? Does anybody else have a toy that they love?
Yes.
She has a duck.
You have
a stick. It's a hard.
A duck. I say, well, do you know, I went to the University of Oregon, so I love ducks especially. What does a duck say? Yes. Sometimes they're very quiet. Well, oops. I brought a picture.
Yeah, that's my favorite toy.
Who is that?
Woody.
Woody. And where do you see Woody?
Toy Story.
Toy Story. Have you all seen Toy Story?
Yes. Yes.
So who does Woody belong to?
The boy.
The boy. Does anybody remember? Andy. And do you know how we know that?
Because he told us.
He told us. But also, what is this?
It says Andy on his boot.
It says Andy on his boot. Do you remember that? So here's my question. Who do you think who does Woody think belongs to whom in Toy Story? Does Woody belong to Andy, or does Andy belong to Woody?
Andy belongs to Woody.
Andy belongs to Woody. Do you ever feel like that? That sometimes you belong to the things that you love?
Hey, can I see Papa?
I think Papa belongs to Violet.
I think that makes very good sense. So that is what we're talking about today. It's not just what we own, what belongs to us, but who we belong to as well. So did you bring favorite books today that you were going to talk about in your RE classes?
No.
I read it somewhere. Who has a favorite book? What's your favorite book?
My favorite book would be Nate the Great.
Nate the Great. I love Nate the Great.
And Winnie the Pooh.
And Winnie the Pooh. Do those books belong to you now that you've read them? Yeah. Sometimes the books that we love, we belong to as well. So, I think you guys are going off to a class now. So think about who you belong to, but also who belongs to you. All right? Thank you.
The children are excused for Ari.
Well, my joy is that I'm here with you all today. And I have to say, this is the first time I've spoken in front of a congregation not my own in a really long time. So I'm just lifting that up. I'd like to lead us in a time of meditation. But before we do that, I'd like to read the words of Quaker teacher Douglas Steere. He writes, "The ancient question, whom am I, inevitably leads to a deeper one. Whose am I? Because there is no identity outside of relationship. You cannot be a person by yourself. To ask whose am I is to extend the question far beyond the little self-absorbed self and to wonder who needs you, who loves you, to whom are you accountable, to whom do you answer, whose life is altered by your choices, with whose life is your own bound up inextricably, in obvious or invisible ways." So given those words, I invite you now to settle into your seat. Take a deep breath. Maybe soften your shoulders. And if you feel comfortable, go ahead and close your eyes. Call to mind the face of a person that answers the question, whose am I? Who needs me? Who loves me? To whom am I accountable? See that face. Feel their presence. Now, call to mind another person who answers that question. Whose am I? Who needs me? Who loves me? Whose life is altered by my choices? See that face. Feel that presence. Now call to mind yet another face. The face of one who answers the question, whose am I? Who needs me? Who loves me? Whose life is bound up in mine own? May we feel the presence of all those to whom we belong, today and always. Amen, and blessed be.
Good morning. Today's reading is from an episode of The West Wing. If you've ever watched The West Wing, you saw various episodes in which President Jed Bartlett quoted or interpreted Bible verses. In one episode, he's returning from church with his wife, Abby, and they're discussing the sermon with Jed's assistant, Charlie. The sermon had to do with the book of Ephesians, and Jed didn't like it. It sucked.
It was fine. Stop it.
It sucked.
You're talking about church.
Oh, like I'm not already going to hell.
He feels the homily lacked panache.
It did lack panache.
It was a perfectly lovely homily on Ephesians 5:21. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her.
Yeah, she's skipping over the part that says, wives, be subject to your husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is head of the church.
I do skip over that part.
Why?
Because it's stupid.
Okay.
Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he may sanctify her, having cleansed her by washing of water with the word, that he might present the church to himself in something.
In splendor. And I have no problem with Ephesians. And any time you want me to cleanse you with that washing of water, you know I'm up for it.
Then what is your problem?
Hackery. This guy was a hack. He had a captive audience. And the way you know that is I tried to tunnel out of there several times. He had an audience and he didn't know what to do with it.
What do you want him to do? Sing volare?
Couldn't have hurt. Words.
Oh. God, no.
Words, when spoken out loud for the sake of performance, are music. They have rhythm and pitch and timbre and volume. These are the properties of music, and music has the ability to find us and move us and lift us up in ways that literal meanings can't. Do you see?
You are an oratorical snob.
Yes, I am, and God loves me for it.
You said he was sending you to hell.
For other stuff, not for this. You can't just trot out Ephesians, which he blew, by the way. It has nothing to do with husbands and wives. It's all of us. St. Paul begins the passage, be subject to one another, out of reverence to Christ. Be subject to one another. In this day and age of 24-hour cable crap, devoted to feeding the voyeuristic gluttony of the American public, hooked on a bad soap opera that's passing itself off as important. Don't you think you might be able to find some relevance in verse 21? How do we end the cycle? Be subject to one another.
So you can see why I had to draft my husband to help. Do you remember the West Wing? Do you remember when it was? It's amazing how little has changed. Or perhaps how much has changed. I want Jed Bartlett for president. So, be subject to one another. You didn't expect to hear Christian scripture this morning, did you? Especially through the lens of a television president. But we thought this scene resonated with the question, whose are we? And as we face the increasingly vitriolic and polarized political scene in this country, I, for one, take great comfort in a political figure, even a fictional one, who can speak to how we might end the vicious cycle. Be subject to one another. I think the reason this scene resonated for us was because it gets to the heart of the question we're trying to answer today. The question suggested by the words of Douglas Steere I read before our meditation. Not who am I, but whose am I? It's not a question we necessarily ever think about. It's fairly common to say, who am I? I think of the 70s. I think there are a few of you out there who remember the 70s, when people were always going out to find themselves. Do you remember that? I remember as a child listening to my parents talk about a couple, where the wife had decided to leave the marriage and her 5 children to go find herself. It's funny that finding herself meant severing those connections. So what might happen if we were to ask not who am I, but to whom do I belong? Who needs me? Who loves me? To whom am I accountable? To whom do I answer? Whose lives are altered by my choices? With whose lives is my life bound up inextricably, in obvious or invisible ways? With whom, to whom do we belong? And when we find the answers to those questions, we might consider how those answers affect what we do and how we live. At the Unitarian Universalist congregation in Blacksburg, we have a small group ministry. And it's based on spiritual themes that we explore throughout the month. And last month's theme was belonging. And in the small groups, people are invited to choose a spiritual exercise from the packet of readings. It's from the Soul Matters program. And after trying the exercise, people share their experiences during a monthly meeting. And the hope is that the exercises will lead to new awareness or understandings, perhaps even new ways of being. So I'd like to share one of those exercises with you this morning. The directions for this exercise explains it's such a powerful and important truth. We are who we belong to. But it's also a hard truth to remember. The world around us doesn't help. Its focus is on becoming, not belonging. It wants us to wake up every morning and ask, am I succeeding? Not who needs me, or who loves me, or whose life is mine own bound up with. So I wonder if that's true. Do you have the sense that the world wants us to wake up and ask, am I succeeding? Think about the past week. Were your days filled with activities focused on succeeding at something? When we're in school, that's definitely our orientation. Did I succeed at learning the new skill or memorizing the names and dates, understanding the concepts? Did I design the experiment well, or did I write a good paper or ace the exam? Were the comments I made in discussions thoughtful and insightful? Did I ask good questions? Our focus is on success. Yeah? When we move out into the working world, the same holds true, especially if we find ourselves in competitive environments. We have to make more sales, write and publish more articles, attain certain standards of success to maintain our positions or move up the ladder. Our focus is on doing, on becoming, on succeeding. So much of how we define ourselves is on what we are becoming, how we are succeeding. When we meet someone new, we often introduce ourselves by what we do. Yes? And it's very interesting, having been a teacher all my life, especially an English teacher. When you say, oh, I'm an English teacher, what's the first thing that people say?
Oh, you teach?
Or, I have to watch my grammar around you. Think about it. The last time someone new, you met someone new, how did you introduce yourself? Was it by what you did? When we think about our non-work activities, I'm guessing there's a fair amount of focus on success there too. If you're an athlete, any athletes here? You focus on improving your skill and performance, on going faster or farther, earning more points, winning. If you're an artist, you strive to improve your technique and create finer work. Or you might strive for baking or cooking more delicious and satisfying meals. Planting and maintaining more beautiful or bountiful gardens. Writing more clever and complex stories or poetry. Taking more stunning photographs. Heck, sometimes I find myself striving to fold the laundry more neatly, especially fitted sheets. You know what I'm talking about. Yes. So much of what we do in the world does focus on success. But this spiritual exercise asks us to engage in a bit of course correction and see what happens when who we belong to is front and center at the start of every day. During the meditation, I asked you to call to mind the faces of those to whom you belong to. Think back to those faces. Were they family members? Yeah. Our parents and siblings and extended families are the people with whom we first feel that sense of belonging. When we're small, we belong to our parents and our families. And they help define who we are and what we do. We learn what it means to be loved and cared for, or not. We learn how to show love and care. And if we've established our own families, then we belong to our spouses, or partners, or children. Were those faces your friends? As we become adolescents and adults, we begin to belong to our closest friends, those people with whom we choose to spend our time and our hearts. Were they colleagues or co-workers? Because so much of our waking days are spent working, and especially in fields that require a great deal of collaboration, we can begin to feel like we belong to those people with whom we work, if not to the corporations or institutions where we work. Anyone ever feel like you belong to your employer? Yeah. Rather than thinking I belong to my employer, though, I'd encourage you to think of those individuals to whom you feel a true sense of connection and belonging. Were they members of clubs or organizations to which you belong? I wonder if, as you considered whose am I, you might have considered some of the people in this room here at the Unitarian Universalist Church of the Highlands. Anyone? As I thought about what it has meant for me to belong to a UU congregation, particularly my home congregation in Charlottesville, I had a little epiphany. From our perspective, we belong to a religious or spiritual community like UUCH when we attend services or join in one of the many activities, like that Thanksgiving luncheon. And the more invested we become, the greater the sense of belonging. At all the newcomer orientations I've ever attended as a layperson or a minister, when asked what brought you here, people almost invariably answer, I was seeking a community where I felt I could belong. I think of the words, we laugh, we cry. Do you all know that hymn? We laugh, we cry, we live, we die. We need to feel there's something here to which we can belong. And we have found a need, a time, a place to be together. But here comes the epiphany part. I realize that we can think about belonging not just from our own perspective, but from that of the community. When we belong, we also begin to feel a sense of responsibility and accountability to the community. And so we belong to our churches in the same way that Andy belongs to Woody and Buzz Lightyear in Toy Story. Does that make sense? And that's why it becomes important to ask the question, whose are we? Because when we concentrate on who needs us, who loves us, to whom are we accountable, then our focus will move from becoming to belonging. And when our focus moves to belonging, we consider the sense of responsibility and accountability, not just to ourselves, but to those we love. And that's why the scene from the West Wing really resonated with me. When President Jed Bartlett opines, "Be subject to one another," in this day and age of 24-hour cable crap devoted to feeding the voyeuristic gluttony of the American public, hooked on a bad soap opera that's passing itself off as important, don't you think we might be able to find some relevance in verse 21? How do we end the cycle? Be subject to one another. When we are subject to one another, we consider how we are responsible and accountable to one another. Now, the language of the scriptures can be as troubling to us as it was to Abby Bartlett. We can agree that it's stupid when we say, "Wives, be subject to your husbands." That is a vestige of a patriarchal culture. But biblical scholar Virginia Ramey Malincott affirms Jed Bartlett's interpretation, writing about verse 21. When Paul speaks of wives submitting themselves to their husbands, he is building upon the concept that every Christian is intended to submit to every other Christian, to serve every other Christian, to defer lovingly to every other Christian. So as we think about those to whom we belong, we can build upon that concept that as part of the interdependent web of all existence, not just the Christian church, we may commit to serving and deferring lovingly to those to whom we belong, if not to the rest of that interdependent web. So I hope I've piqued your interest about what it might feel like to try out the spiritual exercises. And I want to share the actual exercise as it's described in the Soul Matters packet before we move forward. So there are 4 steps. The first is to clear off a space on a table, dresser, desk, or shelf in your house. Can you think of a place that you might clear off? It's a tough one for me too. Or maybe clear off the refrigerator. Could you do that? Over a few days or a week, populate that space with pictures of people who come to mind when you ask yourself, whose am I? Find or print out the pictures. Add as many as feels right. But push yourself to think beyond the obvious answers. Your family, your church community. Treat the question as a meditation practice. Whose am I? Asking it each day will lead you to unexpected pictures. A mentor, an unknown boy on the other side of the world suffering because of climate change caused by us. Those who have been excluded from our faith because of white-centered structures. Or maybe it will take you beyond people, to a pet from your childhood or that park you walk in every Saturday of the fall. So think for a minute. Whose am I? So I'm going to interrupt the explanation of the exercise here. Do you see how widely we might answer that question of whose am I? If we consider all those whom our actions might affect, it would include people we don't even know, like a boy on the other side of the world whose life is affected by climate change, or a worker in a sweatshop that makes the clothes we wear or the technology that we use. Or a person whose identity isn't deemed worthy of equal rights or protection under the law. If we truly believe that we are part of one human family, then it's also true that answering the question, whose are we, will yield answers that stretch far beyond our own network of family and friends, co-workers, and congregants. If we truly believe in the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part, then as we continue the meditation, think how wide that circle of concern might grow. So, here's the rest of the exercise. Third step. Once the space is filled with your chosen pictures, spend another week or two using it as an altar of sorts. Pause briefly before it every morning. Or maybe not so briefly. Fourth step. Pay attention to how bringing your network of belonging changes your days. Journal about it. Discuss it with your partner or a friend. So that's the invitation today. Continue to consider whose am I, keeping the network as tight or as loose as feels right to you. Collect some photographs to put in a place where you can see them every day. Think about what it might mean to belong to these people, these places, these pets. Then pay attention to how shifting your focus from becoming to belonging affects your days. Maybe just a little, but perhaps a lot. And I also invite you as a congregation to ask that question collectively. Whose are we? Who needs us? Who loves us? To whom are we accountable? To whom do we answer? Whose lives are altered by our choices? Before I came here, I looked at your website, and I was delighted to see your vision statement. It says, having no creeds or doctrines, we encourage personal and community growth through a variety of programs, experiences, and dialogue. We seek to build a sense of community by encouraging fellowship among our diverse membership and participating with others in the larger community. Our community involvement demonstrates our belief in the individual's responsibility to self, others, and our environment. So, perhaps I'm preaching to the choir, but as you consider how to live into your mission and your vision, you can and should look outside this circle to the wider community. Who needs you? To whom are you accountable? Whose lives are affected by your choices? So let us remember that our lives are not just about becoming, about success, but also about belonging. And as we focus on those relationships of belonging and accountability, may they help us to become who we most want to be, our very best selves. Amen and blessed be.